By the time I reached the front gate of Silver Crest Estates, their million-dollar golf course looked like it had been burned alive. 3 days earlier, the fairway had been bright green, trimmed so perfectly it looked fake. Now it was yellow, brittle, and cracking under the Arizona sun. The putting green beside the clubhouse was covered in brown patches. The decorative pond behind the 9th hole had dropped so low that mud showed around the stone border. Sprinkler heads clicked in the heat, but nothing came out, and in the middle of it all stood Bradley Mercer, the HOA president, pointing at me like I had destroyed the place with my own hands. His face was red, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and a crowd of homeowners stood behind him, staring at me like I was about to cost them their property values. Bradley shouted that I had sabotaged the community's irrigation system, ruined private HOA property, and would pay for every burned fairway and canceled golf event. I just stood there with dust on my boots and my phone in my hand that made him even angrier. What the crowd did not know was that 3 days earlier, Bradley had been on my land before sunrise. My security camera caught him at 5:42 in the morning, walking beside my south pasture with a steel chain and a padlock. He went straight to my old irrigation valve, wrapped the chain around the handle, snapped the lock shut, and hung an HOA notice on equipment that did not belong to him. He thought that valve only fed my farm. He thought cutting off my water would scare me into signing an access agreement so the HOA could expand their golf cart path across the edge of my property. But that same valve controlled the upstream flow feeding Silver Crest S irrigation pond. So when Bradley accused me in front of the neighborhood, I did not argue. I opened the security footage and turned my phone toward the crowd. The video showed everything. Bradley sued. His face, his hands on the chain, and the HOA notice swinging from my valve. For the first time since I had known him, Bradley Mercer stopped talking. Behind him, the dead fairway cracked under the sun. In front of him, every homeowner watched the man who had killed their own golf course. Before Silver Crest Estates existed, before the clubhouse, the private gate, the golf carts, and the stone sign with gold letters at the entrance, that land was just open desert. The scrub brush, dust, and irrigation lines older than most of the houses now sitting behind the HOA wall. My name is Daniel Reed, and I never planned to become the kind of man who had to fight an HOA over water rights. I was not a lawyer, not a developer, not somebody who went looking for property disputes. I was a small farm owner trying to keep 18 acres alive under the Arizona sun. The farm had belonged to my father before it belonged to me. He bought it when land on the edge of town was still affordable, back when people thought the area was too dry, too quiet, and too far from anything important. To him, that was exactly why it mattered. He liked space. He liked silence. He liked waking up before sunrise, walking the irrigation ditch with a cup of coffee, and checking the soil with his bare hands before the heat came down. When he passed, I inherited the place along with all the work that came with it. There were fences to mend, pumps to maintain, weeds to clear, feed bills to pay, and more paperwork than most people imagine when they picture a quiet little farm. But I kept it because it was the last part of my family that still felt alive. Every row of alfalfa, every fruit tree, every stretch of pasture had his fingerprints on it somehow. The old irrigation valve beside the south pasture did not look important. It was just a weathered metal wheel, half shaded by a mesquite tree, with a faded tag bolted to the pipe. Most people driving past would never notice it, but that valve was the heart of the property. When it opened, water moved through the lateral canal, filled the farm ditches, fed the trees. It kept the pasture from turning to dust, and made it possible for my horses to have shade, feed, and clean water through the hottest months of the year. My father used to say that in Arizona, land without water was just a tax bill with scenery. That was why I knew my deed. I knew my survey. I knew where my property line ran. I knew the recorded easement language, because my father had made me read it when I was still young enough to think all paperwork was boring. He told me that someday somebody with more money, and nicer shoes, and a louder voice might act like my land was only valuable if they could use it. When that day came, he said, I should not depend on memory. I should depend on records. For years, that advice felt unnecessary. Then Silver Crest Estates arrived, At first, I had no problem with the development. The old ranch land east of my farm was sold to a developer. It surveyed, graded, and turned into a luxury gated community. Trucks came in for months. Roads were paved. Stucco homes rose out of the desert. Palm trees appeared where creosote bushes used to grow. Then came the clubhouse, the fitness center, the tennis courts, the artificial lake, and finally the private 9-hole golf course that became the pride of the neighborhood. I stayed on my side of the fence. They stayed on theirs. That was all I wanted. But the people running Silver Crest never looked at my farm the way my father had to them. It was not history. It was not family land. It was not a working property that existed long before their HOA bylaws. It was an eyesore, a reminder that their perfect desert resort community had been built next to something real, dusty, useful, and outside their control. The complaints started small. A letter about the color of my barn roof, even though I was not part of the HOA. A note about equipment parked near the fence line. A warning about dust from my gravel drive. Then came comments from residents who slowed their golf carts near the boundary and stared at my pasture, like the horses were violating some luxury aesthetic standard. I ignored most of it, not because it did not bother me, but because I had work to do. Farms do not pause for neighborhood politics. Pumps fail, hay prices rise, animals get sick. Irrigation schedules matter. I had no interest in wasting my mornings arguing with people who moved next to a farm, and then seemed offended that a farm was there. Bradley Mercer became HOA president about 2 years after Silver Crest opened. From the first time I met him, I could tell. He was the kind of man who confused position with authority. He wore pressed polo shirts with the HOA logo, carried a leather folder to every conversation, and spoke as if every sentence had already been approved by a board that existed to agree with him. His main obsession was the strip of land along my south pasture. It bordered the golf course and followed the same old irrigation corridor my father had protected for decades. Bradley wanted the HOA to widen the golf cart path there and create a prettier buffer between Silver Crest and my farm. He called it beautification. I called it taking land they did not own. He sent proposals. I declined them. He sent revised proposals. I declined those too. Then he began suggesting that cooperation would be better for everyone, that my refusal was creating tension, and that the HOA had resources I probably did not want to challenge. Every message was polite on the surface, but the meaning underneath was always the same. He wanted access, and he expected me to give in because his community had money. I never hated Silver Crest. I never wanted their golf course to fail. I never wanted a fight with the residents. I only wanted the same thing most property owners want: to be left alone on land I legally owned. And maybe that is why this story matters, because when an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone with a fancy title starts acting like your property rights are just an inconvenience, the first thing they count on is your silence. They count on you being too tired, too intimidated, or too unfamiliar with your own records to push back. So if you have ever dealt with someone who thought a board position gave them power over land they did not own, you already understand exactly how a quiet boundary dispute can turn into something much bigger. For me, that bigger thing started with water. Bradley had tried letters. He had tried pressure. He had tried making me look unreasonable in front of his board. None of it worked, so he moved from words to action. And the one thing he chose to touch was the one thing no one in Arizona should ever touch without understanding the paperwork behind it: the irrigation valve. The morning Bradley Mercer turned a property dispute into a legal disaster started before sunrise, when the desert was still cool and the sky over my east field had that pale blue color that only lasted a few minutes before the heat arrived. I was walking the south pasture with a flashlight, checking the irrigation flow the way I did almost every morning. In July, water was not something you checked later. Later was when leaves curled. Later was when soil hardened. Later was when a small problem became a dead crop. The alfalfa field had been scheduled for a deep run that morning, and the young peach trees near the fence needed steady water before the afternoon sun hit them. At first, I thought the pump had lost pressure. The ditch that should have been carrying a slow, steady sheet of water was barely moving. The surface was low, thin, and broken, with little patches of exposed mud along the edges. I followed the line toward the old valve beside the mesquite tree, expecting to find a clogged screen or a mechanical failure. What I found instead stopped me in the dirt. A brand new steel chain was wrapped through the valve wheel. A heavy padlock hung from it, and beside the lock, swinging slightly in the morning air, was a laminated notice with the Silver Crest HOA logo printed across the top. The notice claimed that water diversion had been suspended pending HOA review. It listed no county order, no irrigation district order, no court order, no emergency notice, and no authority outside the HOA's own letterhead. It was written like an official document, but it was attached to equipment sitting on my land, behind my fence, beside my pasture, on a parcel that had never belonged to Silver Crest. For a few seconds, I just stood there, listening to the pump strain against the restricted flow. Then I looked toward the golf course, beyond the boundary wall. The sprinklers on their side were still cycling in the distance, faint white arcs catching the early light. Their fairway was green. Their pond was full. Their cart path curved neatly behind my fence line, exactly where Bradley had wanted to expand it for months. That was when I understood what he had done. He had not made a mistake. He had not sent a contractor to the wrong place. He had not misunderstood a boundary marker. He had walked onto my property and locked my valve because I had refused to sign his access agreement. I took pictures before I touched anything. The chain, the lock, the notice, the valve tag, the fence line, the hoofprints near the pasture gate. The tire tracks pressed into the dust near the service entrance. I photographed the entire scene from every angle because I already knew what Bradley would do next. Men like him never start with the truth. They start with a version of events that makes them sound responsible. By 7:30 that morning, my phone was ringing. Bradley did not sound embarrassed. He sounded pleased with himself. He spoke in the calm, polished voice he used at HOA meetings, the voice that made an accusation sound like a policy update. He claimed the HOA had taken temporary control of the irrigation issue because my water use was affecting drainage near the golf course. He said Silver Crest had a duty to protect common area landscaping, resident amenities, and the financial interest of the community. He kept using words like review, compliance, mitigation, and cooperation, as if repeating official-sounding language could turn trespassing into authority. I told him the valve was on my property. He said the impact of the valve extended beyond my property. I told him he had no right to lock equipment he did not own. He said the board had concerns. I told him to remove the lock. That was when the polite voice slipped. Underneath it was the real Bradley, the one who had been hiding behind letterhead for months. He made it clear that the lock would stay in place until I agreed to let the HOA inspect, access, and modify the irrigation corridor along my south pasture. He reminded me that Silver Crest had attorneys, engineers, contractors, and residents who were tired of looking at what he called an outdated agricultural strip beside a premium golf amenity. He did not have to say the threat plainly. It was there in every pause. He wanted me to understand that I was one farmer against a gated community full of money. By noon, the damage had already started. The alfalfa rows closest to the ditch began to dull from green to gray. The peach trees near the fence drooped at the edges. The ground around the pasture trough was dry enough to crack beneath my boots. I moved what water I could from storage tanks, but those tanks were meant for emergencies, not for replacing an entire irrigation schedule during a heat wave. Every hour, the valve stayed locked. The farm lost ground, and Bradley kept escalating. That afternoon, an email went out to the residents of Silver Crest Estates. I know because 3 different homeowners forwarded it to me, 2 with concern and 1 with a message accusing me of putting their community at risk. Bradley had written that an ongoing water dispute with the adjacent farm had required the HOA to suspend an unauthorized diversion affecting Silver Crest infrastructure. He described the situation as a protective action. He suggested that my refusal to cooperate had created operational risk for the golf course, the pond system, and neighborhood landscaping. He made it sound like I had been stealing from them. By evening, cars started slowing near my fence. Golf carts paused on the cart path. People stared toward my pasture. One man took pictures of my barn. A woman near the boundary wall filmed my irrigation ditch with her phone. Someone left a folded copy of the HOA email wedged into my front gate, as if I had not already seen the lie spreading through the neighborhood. The worst part was not the gossip. It was the calculation behind it. Bradley knew exactly what public pressure could do. He knew most residents would not read parcel maps or recorded easements. They would see a dry golf course, then hear that the farm next door was involved, and assume the man with the HOA title was telling the truth. He was trying to isolate me before I could defend myself. He wanted the neighborhood angry enough to make me surrender. The next morning, he sent another message, this time directly to me, and copied to 2 board members. He attached the same access agreement I had already rejected. The agreement would have allowed HOA contractors to enter the irrigation corridor, install monitoring equipment, alter drainage features, and maintain a widened buffer path along my fence line. The language was dressed up as temporary cooperation, but the effect was obvious. Once they had access, they would never give it back easily. I did not sign. I did not cut the lock either. That choice mattered more than Bradley realized. A younger version of me might have grabbed bolt cutters, removed the chain, and dared him to complain. A tired version of me wanted to do exactly that. My crops were suffering, my horses were depending on backup water, and my father's land was being treated like a bargaining chip by a man who had probably never opened an irrigation gate in his life. But I knew how property fights worked. The moment I cut that lock myself, Bradley would shift the story. He would accuse me of damaging HOA equipment, interfering with a community safety measure, or escalating the dispute. He would turn his trespass into my reaction. He would make the lock the issue instead of the illegal act that put it there. So I left it untouched. I documented everything. I printed the emails. I saved the voicemails. I photographed the dying edges of the crop rows with timestamps. I recorded the pump pressure readings. I wrote down the temperature, the irrigation schedule, and the exact hours my field went without proper flow. I called my crop insurer and opened a preliminary claim. I called the irrigation district and requested the maintenance records for that valve. I called my attorney's office and asked for the earliest appointment available. Meanwhile, Bradley walked around Silver Crest like he had won. On the second day, one of my neighbors outside the HOA told me Bradley had been bragging near the clubhouse that the farm would cooperate once it realized the cost of being difficult. He said the HOA was tired of being held hostage by old rural arrangements. He said progress required firm leadership. He said the golf course was too important to let one stubborn landowner control the future of the community. By the third day, the first visible brown streaks appeared across Silver Crest's fairway. At first, the residents thought it was a sprinkler timing issue. Then, the putting green near the clubhouse began spotting. Then, the pond behind the 9th hole dropped several inches. Then, the maintenance crew started running around in utility carts, opening panels, checking pumps, staring at gauges that were not giving them the answers they wanted. Bradley had been so focused on hurting my farm that he never stopped to understand the system he was touching. He thought the valve was mine alone. He thought the water stopped with me. He thought a chain and a laminated HOA notice could rewrite recorded property rights, old irrigation maps, and decades of water infrastructure. But the desert does not care about titles. Water follows pipes, grades, valves, and legal rights, not ego. By the time Bradley realized the golf course was starving too, he had already created a paper trail, a video trail, and a damaged trail that all led back to the same place, the locked valve on my land. The first thing I did after Bradley locked that valve was not call him back. That was harder than it sounds. When you are standing on your own land, looking at a chain wrapped around equipment your father maintained for decades, every part of you wants to react. You want to grab bolt cutters. You want to march into the HOA office. You want to stand in front of the clubhouse and tell every resident exactly what kind of man their president is. But anger is easy to use against you. Paper is harder. So I went back to the house, sat at my kitchen table, and made a folder on my laptop with one name, Silver Crest Valve Incident. Then I started building the kind of record Bradley Mercer could not talk his way around. I began with the security cameras. Years earlier, after a few tools disappeared from my equipment shed, I installed cameras facing the barn, the pasture gate, the south fence, and the irrigation corridor. They were not fancy, but they caught motion, time, date, and enough detail to show faces and vehicles. I opened the footage from the morning the valve was locked and started scrolling backward through the dark hours before sunrise. At 5:39, headlights appeared near the service pull-off by my south pasture. At 5:41, a black SUV stopped beside the fence. At 5:42, Bradley Mercer stepped into frame. There he was in a pale polo shirt, khaki pants, and the same expensive watch. He liked to tap during board meetings when he thought someone was wasting his time. Behind him walked another man I recognized from the Silver Crest Landscape Committee. Bradley carried the chain. The other man carried the laminated notice. They did not look confused. They did not wander around like people who had reached the wrong property by mistake. They walked directly to the valve as if the plan had already been discussed. Bradley bent down, looped the chain through the wheel, pulled it tight, snapped the padlock into place, then stood back while the other man attached the notice. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes to create a six-figure disaster. I watched the clip 3 times without moving. Then I saved it to my computer, copied it to an external drive, uploaded it to cloud storage, and emailed it to myself. I made sure the original file stayed untouched. I had learned enough from insurance claims and equipment disputes to know that evidence is only useful when nobody can accuse you of changing it. After that, I started photographing the physical scene again. Slower this time, not just the lock, but the surrounding area. The fence post with my private property sign, the irrigation district tag on the valve stem, the tire tracks near the gate, the footprints in the dust, the distance between the valve and the HOA boundary wall. I took wide shots, close-ups, and angle shots, showing that nobody could reach that valve from HOA common property without crossing onto my parcel. Then I printed every email Bradley had sent me over the previous 6 months. The access proposals, the revised access proposals, the messages about beautification, the warnings about community expectations, the subtle reminders that Silver Crest had legal resources, and that cooperation would be in my best interest. By themselves, some of those emails sounded almost polite. Together, they showed pressure, they showed motive, they showed a pattern. Bradley had wanted control of that irrigation corridor long before he ever touched the valve. Next came the paperwork my father had left behind. He had kept land records the way some people keep family photographs. Deeds, surveys, tax maps, easement agreements, pump receipts, irrigation schedules, handwritten notes from district technicians, old county letters with faded stamps, all organized in metal file boxes in the office closet. When I was younger, I used to roll my eyes at those boxes that morning. They felt like a wall standing between my farm and a man who thought HOA letterhead was stronger than recorded law. I pulled the deed first, then the most recent survey, then the old irrigation easement documents. The language was dry, but the meaning was not. The South Irrigation Corridor was part of Reed Farm's recorded property interests. The valve location was inside my parcel boundary. The lateral canal had been documented decades before Silver Crest existed, and most importantly, my farm held senior irrigation rights tied to agricultural use, with maintenance and access protections that could not be overridden by a private HOA. I kept reading until I found the agreement that changed everything. It was recorded in 2004, when the developer was still preparing the land that would become Silver Crest Estates. The developer had needed reliable supplemental irrigation for the future golf course and landscape ponds. Instead of building an entirely separate water delivery system, they had negotiated limited use of flow through the existing lateral canal. Subject to the older Reed Farm rights, the condition was clear. Silver Crest could benefit from that water only as long as it did not obstruct, alter, restrict, or interfere with Reed Farm's access, the maintenance, or operation of the irrigation system. Bradley had not just locked my valve. He had violated the condition that allowed his own community to receive water through that system. I sat there for a long moment with the document in my hand, hearing my father's voice in my head. He had always told me that land disputes were rarely won by the person with the loudest truck, the biggest house, or the fanciest title. They were won by the person who knew what was recorded at the county office. So I called the county recorder and requested certified copies of the deed. the easement agreement, and the 2004 developer filing. Then I called the irrigation district and gave them the valve tag number. The woman on the phone went quiet when I read it out. She asked me to repeat the number. I did. Then she asked whether the valve was currently locked. I told her it was, and that the lock had been placed there by the HOA president from the neighboring subdivision. There was another pause, longer this time. When she came back, her tone had changed. She told me that valve L17 was part of a regulated lateral control point, and that no private party was authorized to lock it without an emergency order or district work authorization. I asked whether any such order existed. She said there was no record of one. Then she asked me not to disturb the lock until a district technician or inspector could review the site. That was when I knew this was bigger than a personal fight. I called my attorney next. Her name was Karen Holt, and she had helped a neighbor of mine years earlier with an easement dispute involving a blocked access road. Karen was calm in the way good attorneys are calm, not because the situation is small, but because they understand that panic wastes time. I sent her everything, the video, the photos, the HOA notice, the emails, the deed, the survey, the easement, the 2004 agreement, and the irrigation district information. She reviewed enough that afternoon to call me back before closing time. Her advice was simple. Do not cut the lock. Do not threaten Bradley. Do not confront the residents. Keep documenting the damage. Preserve every communication and let the agencies create their own record. So that was what I did. I walked the farm twice a day with my phone. I filmed the dry ditch. I filmed the pump gauges. I filmed the curled edges of the peach leaves and the dulling alfalfa rows. I logged the temperature, the time, the pressure readings, and the water levels in my backup tanks. I photographed the horses drinking from temporary troughs I had to refill manually. I kept receipts for emergency water hauling, extra feed, and replacement irrigation parts I might need if the pump burned out from strain. At the same time, I watched Silver Crest start to suffer from the other side of the fence. On the first day, their sprinklers still ran, but weakly. The arcs were uneven, and some heads sputtered like they had air in the line. The maintenance workers opened green utility boxes along the cart path and stared down at valves they clearly expected to behave differently. On the second day, the pond behind the 9th hole began dropping. Not dramatically at first, but enough for the water line to pull away from the stone edge. The fairway near the south boundary lost its deep green shine. A few residents stood outside their carts, pointing at the grass as if staring at it might reverse the damage. By the third day, the course looked sick. The Bermuda grass turned patchy yellow. The putting green near the clubhouse showed brown islands spreading through the surface. The maintenance crew parked 2 utility vehicles near the pump house, and a contractor truck arrived with men who looked hot, confused, and worried. They were checking downstream symptoms while the cause sat upstream on my land, wrapped in Bradley-esque chain. That was the part he had never understood. He thought the irrigation system was a simple line between my farm and his anger. He thought if he squeezed my side hard enough, I would give him what he wanted. But water infrastructure is not simple just because a person refuses to read the map. The old lateral canal did not care about his HOA title. The recorded easement did not care about his board vote. The valve did exactly what valves do when someone locks them. It stopped flow, and the system downstream began to die. By the time Karen prepared the first demand letter, I had more than enough evidence to show what happened, that she wanted more than a story. She wanted the kind of file that could survive denial, insurance review, county inspection, and a room full of angry residents. So we organized everything by time. First, Bradley's pressure campaign. Then the rejected access agreement. Then the early morning trespass. Then the locked valve. Then the HOA email accusing me of causing the water problem. Then the farm damage. Then the golf course damage. Then the irrigation district confirmation. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. Bradley had tried to make me look like the threat. Instead, he had created a timeline showing that the threat came from him. That night, I stood beside the mesquite tree and looked at the lock one more time. The metal was still bright and new. The HOA notice still hung from the chain, pretending to have authority. Beyond the wall, I could hear golf course sprinklers clicking dry in the dark. For the first time since the whole thing started, I did not feel helpless. I felt ready. The legal turn did not come from a dramatic courtroom moment. It came from a scanned document with a county recording stamp in the corner, buried inside a file most people in Silver Crest estates had probably never known existed. Karen found it first. But the moment she sent it to me, I recognized the shape of it. It was the 2004 agreement between my father and the developer that had built Silver Crest. I had seen copies of it before, but I had never read it under pressure, with my irrigation valve locked, my crop rows drying, a golf course dying on the other side of the wall. This time, every sentence felt different. The agreement explained that Silver Crest's developer had been granted limited use of supplemental irrigation flow through the existing lateral canal system. That use was not ownership. It was not control. It was not authority over the valve, the corridor, or the farm. It was a conditional benefit tied to the older agricultural water rights that already belonged to Reed Farm. And the condition was written plainly enough that even Bradley Mercer would have understood it if he had ever bothered to read beyond his own HOA letterhead. Silver Crest, its successors, managers, contractors, agents, or assigns could not obstruct, restrict, alter, lock, interfere with, or deny Reed Farm access to the irrigation control points serving the lateral canal. That one sentence changed the entire case. Bradley had not found a loophole. He had not exercised an HOA power. He had not protected community infrastructure. He had done the exact thing the agreement prohibited. He had taken a chain and a padlock, walked onto the property that held the senior rights, and physically restricted the control point that allowed his own community to receive supplemental water. He had broken the condition that kept Silver Crest connected to the system. For months, Bradley had acted like the irrigation corridor was some outdated rural nuisance standing in the way of his polished community plan. He talked about beautification, resident expectations, drainage concerns, and premium amenities. He made it sound like the farm was the old problem and the HOA was the modern solution. But the county records told a different story. Silver Crest had been built around the old water system, not above it. The golf course existed because the developer had negotiated a narrow, fragile permission to benefit from water infrastructure that came before the clubhouse, before the gates, before the board, and before Bradley's title. He had mistaken dependence for dominance. Karen prepared the demand letter that same evening. It was not emotional. That was what made it powerful. It laid out the timeline in clean, cold order. Bradley's repeated attempts to obtain access to my south irrigation corridor, my written refusals, the early morning entry onto my parcel, the security footage showing him locking valve L17, the HOA notice claiming authority over equipment outside its boundaries, the resident email accusing me of creating the water problem, the crop damage on my side, the visible failure of the Silver Crest irrigation system on theirs, the recorded easement, the 2004 agreement, the irrigation district confirmation that no emergency order or work authorization existed. By the time Karen finished putting it together, Bradley's story had nowhere left to stand. The letter demanded immediate preservation of all HOA communications, including board messages, landscape committee notes, contractor emails, text messages, security logs, maintenance reports, and any insurance correspondence related to the valve, the irrigation corridor, the golf course, or me. It demanded a written retraction of the claim that I had caused the water disruption. It demanded that the lock be removed only under irrigation district supervision, not by the same people who had placed it there. It demanded compensation for farm damages, emergency water costs, attorney fees, and any additional losses tied to the interruption. Most importantly, Karen sent copies to the HOA's insurance carrier, the irrigation district, the county inspector's office, then the registered agent for Silver Crest Estates. That was the moment the dispute stopped being Bradley's private pressure campaign. Now there were adults in the room. Bradley reacted exactly the wrong way. Instead of turning quiet, preserving records, and letting the HOA attorney handle it, he sent an angry email to the board and copied me by mistake in it. He claimed the HOA had been forced to take decisive action because I had refused reasonable cooperation. He wrote that the valve was a leverage point in a broader access problem, and that the board needed to stand firm before the farm realized Silver Crest was serious. That phrase, leverage point, did more damage to him than anything I could have written. It proved the lock was not a safety measure. It was not an emergency response. It was not a neutral review of water flow. It was pressure. It was a tactic. It was exactly what I had known from the beginning, now typed out by the man who did it. Karen forwarded that email to the HOA attorney with no dramatic commentary. She did not need any. The evidence spoke better without decoration. Within hours, the tone from Silver Crest changed. The first message from their attorney was cautious. The second was shorter. The third asked whether I would agree to allow an irrigation district technician to access the valve for inspection. No apology came from Bradley, but the silence around him started to feel different. The residents, who had been glaring at my fence, were now asking questions inside their own community forum. Someone wanted to know why the golf course depended on a valve outside HOA property. Someone else asked whether the board had voted to lock it. Another resident wanted to see the actual water agreement. A retired engineer living near the fourth hole posted that no one with basic infrastructure experience should ever restrict an upstream valve without mapping downstream consequences. The anger that had been pointed at me began turning back toward the clubhouse. That was when the second legal problem surfaced. The golf course maintenance company had been operating under the assumption that water pressure would be maintained through the established lateral feed. Their contract required the HOA to provide access to adequate irrigation supply and to notify them of any known interruption. Bradley had not done that. He had locked the upstream valve, watched the system weaken, and let the maintenance crew chase symptoms downstream for days. By trying to make me look reckless, he had exposed his own HOA to claims from 3 directions at once. The farm had damages. The irrigation district had a possible tampering violation. The golf course contractor had a service disruption caused by unauthorized board action. And the insurance company now had a reason to question whether the loss was accidental or the predictable result of an intentional act. That last part hit Silver Crest the hardest. The burned fairway was expensive. A denied insurance claim was terrifying. The more the board understood, the more Bradley lost control of the room. He tried to blame the developer for leaving behind a confusing water arrangement. He tried to blame me for refusing access. He tried to say the valve was not marked clearly enough. He tried to call it a misunderstanding. But a misunderstanding does not come with 6 months of pressure emails. A rejected access agreement, a pre-dawn visit, a steel chain, a laminated HOA notice, and a follow-up email calling the valve a leverage point. The facts were too organized. That was the beauty of waiting. If I had cut the lock that first morning, Bradley would have made the story about my reaction. He would have told the residents I damaged HOA property. He would have claimed I escalated. That he would have hidden behind confusion, long enough to muddy the issue. But because I left the lock in place, every agency and every attorney could see the scene exactly as Bradley created it. His chain, his notice, his timing, his motive, and behind it all, the dead grass on the golf course was becoming impossible to ignore. By the 4th day, Silver Crest looked like a luxury brochure left too long in the sun. The fairway edges had turned straw-colored. The pond near the 9th hole sat low and ugly, with mud showing beneath the decorative rocks. The putting green had brown patches spreading across the surface like burns. Residents who once complained about my farm equipment were now photographing their own course in disbelief. The HOA called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Bradley wanted to frame it as a response to outside interference. Karen called it an opportunity to create a public record. She told me to bring nothing extra, say very little, and let the documents do the work. The irrigation district confirmed that a representative would attend. The county inspector's office also sent notice that they intended to review the valve access issue, the recorded easement, and the alleged unauthorized interference with a regulated control point. For the first time, Bradley was not summoning me to explain myself. He was being summoned to explain himself. I remember standing at my kitchen table before that meeting, looking at the folder Karen had prepared. It was thick now. Video stills, emails, deed records, survey maps, easement language, the 2004 agreement, irrigation district notes, damage logs, photographs from both sides of the fence. Every page had a date. Every file had a source. Every claim had something behind it stronger than emotion. That was when I understood what my father had tried to teach me all those years ago. The property rights are quiet until someone violates them. Then, if you have kept your records, they become louder than any bully in a polo shirt. Bradley had spent months treating my land like an obstacle. Now the paperwork was about to treat him like the problem. The emergency meeting at Silver Crest was supposed to start at 6, but by 5:30 the clubhouse parking lot was already full. Residents stood in small groups near the entrance, whispering, pointing toward the golf course, and looking over their shoulders like they were waiting for a storm to arrive. Behind the clubhouse windows, the view that used to sell homes in Silver Crest had turned into evidence. The fairway closest to the patio was no longer deep green. It was pale, burned, and uneven, with wide yellow streaks running through it. The pond behind the 9th hole sat low and muddy, and the reflection of the clubhouse lights looked broken on the shallow water. Bradley Mercer stood near the front of the meeting room, with his arms crossed. He was trying to look calm. He was failing. The old confidence was still there in pieces. The pressed polo shirt, the expensive belt, the leather folder tucked under one arm. But his face had changed. He kept checking the door. He kept leaning toward 2 board members and whispering. Every time someone mentioned the word insurance, his jaw tightened. I walked in with Karen Holt beside me. The room shifted when they saw us. A week earlier, most of those residents had looked at me like I was the problem standing outside their perfect community. That evening, they looked uncertain. Some looked embarrassed. A few would not meet my eyes at all. Karen carried one folder, that was it. No dramatic stack of boxes, no performance. Just one organized folder full of documents Bradley should have read before he ever bought that chain. A few minutes later, the irrigation district representative arrived with a rolled map tube and a clipboard. His name was Martin Alvarez, and he had the tired, direct expression of a man who spent his career dealing with people who touched infrastructure they did not understand. Behind him came a county inspector named Dries Walker. She wore work boots, carried a tablet, and did not smile when Bradley tried to greet her like this was a normal HOA landscaping issue. The meeting started badly for Bradley almost immediately. He opened by saying Silver Crest had been dealing with a complicated water management dispute involving the adjacent farm. He said the HOA had acted in good faith to protect community infrastructure while seeking cooperation from an unresponsive neighboring landowner. He used the same language he had used in emails. Temporary action, operational review, shared impact, community protection. Then Karen stood up and asked one question. Mr. Mercer, did the HOA own valve L17 on the morning you locked it? The room went quiet. Bradley adjusted his folder and said the valve affected HOA systems. Karen repeated the question. Did the HOA own it? He said ownership was not the only issue. That was when Martin Alvarez unrolled the irrigation district map across the front table. He placed one finger on the marked control point and said valve L17 was located on Reed Farm S parcel, tied to the lateral canal under district oversight, and not subject to private HOA control. He then stated there was no emergency order, no district work authorization, and no recorded request permitting Silver Crest or any of its representatives to lock, restrict, or tag that valve. Dries Walker, the county inspector, looked at Bradley and asked whether he had entered Reed Farm with permission. Bradley said there had been an ongoing access discussion. Dries asked again whether he had permission on that specific morning. He did not answer directly. Karen opened her folder and placed 4 printed stills from my security camera on the table. The first showed Bradley S. SUV near my south pasture. The second showed him walking toward the valve with the chain. The third showed his hands wrapping it around the wheel. The fourth showed the HOA notice hanging from my equipment. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. Then one homeowner near the back said, almost under his breath, "That's him. That was the sound of Bradley S. story. Cracking," he tried to recover. He said the action had been taken after repeated concerns about water flow and drainage. He claimed the HOA had reason to believe my farm operations were affecting the golf course pond. He said the notice was not meant as a permanent restriction, only as a temporary pause until the issue could be reviewed. Martin asked who reviewed the irrigation map before the lock was placed. Bradley said the landscape committee had discussed it. Martin asked whether any licensed irrigation engineer, district technician, or county official had approved the action. Bradley looked toward the board. No one helped him. Then Karen read from the 2004 recorded agreement. Her voice stayed level, almost too calm for the room. She read the clause, stating that Silver Crest and its successors could not obstruct, restrict, alter, lock, interfere with, or deny Reed Farm access to the irrigation control points serving the lateral canal. When she said the word lock, several residents turned toward Bradley. For the first time, he looked smaller than his title. Denise Walker began entering notes into her tablet. She said the county would document the incident as unauthorized interference with a recorded irrigation access point and would coordinate with the district on compliance requirements. Martin added that the lock would be removed by a district technician only, and the valve would be inspected for damage or pressure irregularities before normal flow could be fully restored. Bradley said he could have maintenance remove the lock immediately. Martin told him no. Just one word. No, that single word did more than any speech could have done. It told every person in the room that Bradley was no longer in control of the thing he had tried to control. The next morning, Martin met us at the valve with a district technician, Denise Walker, and a representative from the HOA insurance carrier. Bradley arrived too, but he stayed several steps back, arms stiff at his sides, watching a trained technician cut through the chain he had placed there. The technician bagged the lock, photographed the valve, checked the tag number, inspected the stem, and recorded the pressure reading once the line was restored. Water moved through the ditch again slowly at first, then with the steady sound I had been waiting to hear for days. On the Silver Crest side, the maintenance crew finally understood what had happened. The irrigation pond began refilling, that the damage had already been done. Grass does not forgive arrogance quickly in Arizona heat. The fairways would need emergency treatment. Some sections would have to be resodded completely. Putting green near the clubhouse was worse than they had admitted. Then the insurance adjuster asked Bradley who authorized the lockout. Bradley said the board was aware of the issue. One board member immediately said they had never voted to lock anything. Another said they thought Bradley was only asking the district for a review. That was the moment the problem stopped being just a property dispute and became an internal HOA crisis. By the end of that day, Silver Crest had received written notice from the irrigation district requiring a compliance plan, the reimbursement for inspection and technician costs, and written assurance that no HOA board member, contractor, or committee volunteer would access the Reed Farm irrigation corridor again without permission and proper authorization. Karen sent a separate letter demanding retraction of Bradley's statements about me, compensation for my farm losses, and reimbursement of legal fees caused by the unauthorized lockout. The insurance carrier opened a deeper investigation instead of simply approving the golf course claim that terrified the board more than anything else, if the loss was considered the result of an intentional unauthorized act by their president. The Silver Crest could be left paying for a dead golf course with HOA funds. For days, Bradley had tried to make me look like the dangerous one. But when the officials arrived, when the maps came out, when the video played, and when the recorded agreement was read aloud, the truth became simple. I had protected my land. Bradley had touched what he did not own, and the desert had exposed him faster than any courtroom ever could. The first official apology from Silver Crest Estates did not come from Bradley Mercer. It came from the HOA attorney in a carefully written email sent to every homeowner in the community. The message said the prior statements about Reed Farm and the irrigation disruption had been incomplete and inaccurate. It confirmed that I had not sabotaged the golf course, had not interfered with Silver Crest's water system, and had not acted unlawfully. It also confirmed that the irrigation valve had been locked without authorization by HOA leadership. They never used the word blame. They did not have to. Everyone knew who had placed the chain. Within a week, the board called a special meeting. Bradley tried to defend himself at first, but the room was different now. The same residents who once stared at my farm like it was a nuisance were asking about legal exposure, insurance coverage, repair costs, and why one man had been allowed to touch infrastructure outside HOA property without a vote, a permit, or a district order. The answer was simple, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. Bradley had believed his title made him more powerful than recorded property rights. By the end of that meeting, he resigned as HOA president. 2 committee members stepped down with him. The board hired outside counsel to review every agreement connected to the golf course, the irrigation pond, the cart paths, and the boundary with my farm. For the first time since Silver Crest had been built, they were forced to study the land beneath their landscaping. The financial damage was worse than the residents expected. The irrigation district billed the HOA for inspection, technician work, documentation, and compliance review. The golf course contractor charged emergency recovery fees. The several burned sections of fairway had to be stripped and resodded. The putting green near the clubhouse needed deeper repair. 3 weekend events were canceled, including one charity tournament that had been promoted for months. The total cost passed $340,000 before the board stopped giving exact numbers in public meetings. My attorney handled the settlement for my side. The Silver Crest paid for the crop loss, emergency water hauling, legal fees, and the damage to the young peach trees that never recovered from those 3 days without proper irrigation. They also signed a written agreement confirming that no HOA officer, contractor, committee member, resident, or vendor could enter the Reed Farm irrigation corridor without my written permission and proper district authorization. The lock disappeared. The notice disappeared. The attitude took longer, but it changed. After that summer, the golf carts stopped slowing near my fence. Nobody left papers on my gate. Nobody sent me letters about the color of my barn roof. The new HOA president introduced himself by mail, not by threat, and the first sentence of his letter acknowledged that Reed Farm was not part of Silver Crest Estates. That sentence alone would have saved them a fortune, if Bradley had understood it sooner. As for me, I did not celebrate the way some people expected. I did not post Bradley as video online. I did not stand at the fence and laugh at the dead grass. I had watched enough of my own land suffer to know that water disputes are not funny when crops, animals, and livelihoods are involved. I just replaced the small faded sign near my south gate with a larger one. Private property, recorded irrigation easement, no unauthorized access. Every morning after the flow was restored, I walked the ditch the way my father used to. The water moved through the channel again, quiet and steady, reflecting the same brutal sun that had exposed Bradley's arrogance. The farm did not come back all at once. Some rows recovered, some did not. But the land was alive, and more importantly, the boundary was respected. That was the real victory, not the resignation, not the settlement, not the fact that $1 million golf course had been humbled by a $12 padlock. The real victory was proving that a quiet property owner does not become powerless just because a richer neighbor gets louder. Bradley thought he could use pressure, confusion, and an HOA title to force me off my own rights. But titles do not move property lines, letterhead does not erase deeds, and a private board cannot rewrite recorded water rights just because the view from the clubhouse would look cleaner without a working farm next door. So if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, a contractor, or anyone who thought your land was theirs to manage, remember this. Do not let anger become the evidence they use against you. Keep the emails, save the footage, read the deed, check the survey, call the county, follow the process. And if this story made you think of someone who needs that reminder, share it with them. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me whether you think Bradley should have faced more than resignation. And subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary people who protected their homes, their land, and their boundaries the right way.